Mhm. So if I understand, so you're saying it's not just it's worse to have fought this war than to have engaged in diplomacy, but it's worse to have fought this war because you could have helped develop some African country instead.
Yeah, I mean, just an example, a war of self-defense. The Canadians come across the border to invade and attack us, and do horrible things to us, like make us have health care and that sort of thing. And the utilitarian criterion is going to say, you can't fight back because the resources that you would have to use in order to defend yourself would actually do more good if deployed to cure malaria in Africa.
Well, it could be. I mean, it depends on what you think of this come up before, the relevance of self-determination and upholding, the principle of, you might say, national autonomy. And it's conceivable that there could be cases where, I don't think it's very likely, but it could be conceivable that would be less important than doing something to help malaria elsewhere.
Yeah, when you eradicate malaria, you uphold the principle, prevent people from dying of easily eradicable diseases when you do it. Mm-hmm. That comes in favor of that outcome.
But of course, that's not the choice you probably actually face, because you always had that ability to affect malaria before the Canadians came across, and you weren't doing it then. And something's a little disingenuous to say, well, we're not going to fight back because we could be fighting malaria instead, even though we've never done that and probably won't do it now. But I agree that it could be a case that the matter at stake is so trivial, relatively trivial, that perhaps like the Falklands Islands example that you mentioned, that you might think, well, even considering the precedential value and what Professor Herg was saying, the failure to discourage future aggressions, even taking all that into account, it'd still be better if Britain had done something else with its money than send those troops down there. So,
the question right here.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you for the panel. And as I was listening, I was trying to think of some way to distinguish between and among your positions where some case might be concerned. And that might help to draw out the differences between your approaches as well. So I wondered if each of you in turn, beginning with Tom, I guess you, if you could tell us what you would bring to bear if you were called upon, as I am about to call upon you, if you were called upon to discuss what you took to be the most important features of the decision to support the rebels with their support in Libya. How would your views of proportionality or last resort utility, how would you frame the issue? What would be for you the most salient concerns in turn?
Before avoiding that question, can I just say something about distinguishing the views which was sure. Your underlying. Sure. George said he was a Kantian between two utilitarians, yeah. And I thought that was a fair comment about his left, but not such a fair comment about his right, because I was assuming while discussing proportionality that a war had to have a just cause. Yeah. It was a very small list of just causes. It had to be about preventing or reversing a violation of rights. It wasn't a utilitarian calculation, even of proportionality, because lots of benefits of war didn't count. Right. It also wasn't a strictly utilitarian calculation, because some of the evils of war might not count if they were also dependent on wrongful choices by the enemy. And then in the discussion of in bello proportionality, it was supposed to matter that some of the deaths from war would be directly caused by us, namely the collateral harm to enemy civilians. So it was no way a utilitarian view. So about Libya.
How would you,
well, I hate to say it, you're a panel late. Because the question about, and my understanding of proportionality is that the relevant goods, the relevant harms are all the bad things that will follow. The relevant goods are the just causes plus the initial just causes plus any conditional just causes. So to know how to apply proportionality to the Libya case, we have to know what are the just causes. So if it's just preventing large-scale killings of civilians, and that's all, that's the only just cause for intervening, which I think some people were applauding, then the only thing that weighs on the positive side is the prevention of civilian deaths at the hands of Gaddafi's soldiers. But if you take a more liberal view, liberal is quite the word, but if you think of a more expansive view of what the legitimate just causes in Libya are, such that, for example, regime change is a legitimate goal, then the benefits include regime change and all the good that would come to the Libyan people from that. So I really think, I mean, part of my idea was that all that counts on the positive side of a proportionality calculation is the principal just causes plus the conditional ones. And you can't decide what that involves in the Libyan case until you've decided what are the just causes. Is it just the prevention of civilian casualties at the hand of Gaddafi's forces? Is it also regime change? The suggestion was made, I think a couple of panels before, that one of the motivating ideas of the Iraq War, that you could establish a democracy and that would spread democracy in the Middle East. So is a legitimate goal of the Libyan intervention to establish a democracy that might help spread and certainly stop the stopping of the spread of democracy? So I'm avoiding the question by saying you have to know first what the relevant just aims are.
Well, first let me apologize to Tom for tarring him with the unfairly, with the sweeping utilitarian brush. Of course, the proportionality calculations are inherently utilitarian, but he had introduced in his talk and in his paper a number of constraints on what counts. And once you've done that, obviously you've got, in fact, one way of him re-subsuming my position on last resort would be, well, this is just another one of those considerations. In addition to what are relevant goods, you have to make sure that whatever option you're considering, that you've made good faith effort to exhaust all alternatives first. So, but this is, for me, not an issue of, for lack of a better term, philosophical sophistry about which more clever argument can be developed to subsume all the categories of just war or re-explain or reinterpret the tradition. I started, or rather focused, on a very, very important practical dilemma of my own, not the Tripoli problem, but the military technologies problem. That's what drove this. That doesn't help answer what to do about Tripoli, though it does perhaps address what to do about Iran with regard to a cyber versus a conventional attack. In general, though, by thinking that last resort is an important consideration after all to take account of, and that it isn't merely a calculus of alternatives, is to ask whether or not, in this case, recognizing that preventing the slaughter of innocents is itself a justifiable reason for coming to their defense, whether alternatives have been examined and exhausted. And the way I see this is actually sympathetic to your own concern, Professor Elstein, that we not try to over-theorize practical reasoning. This is a very practical consideration. When I say good faith attempts, I mean what reasonable people under circumstances such as I described in all those related areas of discourse where you do something unpleasant that you think otherwise you're not supposed to do, have first attempted to wonder whether there's something less drastic that they could do. And that is not a demand that one do every other alternative thing one could ever envision. And my sense is, when I was talking to some college students at a little liberal arts college in Ohio about this just a few days ago, and they were asking about Libya and what we're doing, and I said, well, I believe our president is a man of principle, and I also think that he's advised by a Secretary of State who's a classmate of mine that who's a very practical man. We have a lot on the plate right now, and it's going to be difficult to take this on, far more so than people realize. And so there was a, caution about getting caught up in this, until finally it seemed there was no alternative, that if we did nothing, we would watch something less drastic than Rwanda, but something perhaps more like what we would have seen in Kosovo if the bombing hadn't begun. And for similar reasons, the decision to avoid getting entangled in this was overridden. And I think in that sense, that was a proper application of the last resort criterion. We made it clear we didn't want to do this. We hoped that there would be other alternatives, but hope, as we know, is not a policy. There really wasn't much else one could do that I can see other than allow the slaughter to happen. Now, who it is that's being slaughtered and what will happen if they're preserved from being killed is, of course, a whole other matter.
I think I'm basically in agreement with that. What I was saying in my paper is that I want to use the ad bellum principles as the basic framework in which we do the analysis of these issues. They're grounded ultimately, I think, in the utilitarian perspective, but that's still, those principles are the ones we should try to apply. So the question for me is about whether it's a just cause or not. And I don't have a well worked out position, but my feeling is that we, as you mentioned in your talk this morning about the developing R2P norm, and I think this is an aspect of that we're evolving towards a sort of new norm of what's acceptable conduct of a government towards its own citizens. And from a utilitarian point of view, that could come to be a recognized sort of norm of international affairs and a just cause in that way. That if you go back to Mill's utilitarianism, or you think about what Sidgwick says about it, from Sidgwick you get the idea of you have certain international duties, and violations of those duties, if they can't be adjudicated, could be a just cause of war. But of course, he's ultimately utilitarian, but the just cause is framed in terms of what international duties you have. And I think we have a kind of evolving norm about what those duties are. And maybe it turned out to have been wishful thinking on my part, but I think, I would like to see that norm reinforced and made a little more secure. David, I have questions for our two panelists. Would it be okay for me to?
Would you mind holding on?
Sure.
For a second?
Okay.
Because there are some people desperately waiting to ask questions.
Yeah. Well, first, just a quick comment to George. Thanks for reminding us that criterion of last resort can be used in support of the use of military force, because any of us who've ever been or know this debate know that usually it is used exactly the other way. There's still something to be done. Whether it's going to do anything or not, we don't know, but still something to be done, etc. But my comment really, and question really, are Perkin. First, a point of personal privilege. When I've written on proportionality, it's because of the nature of the debate that I'm in most of the time, which is with folks in the religious scene, and these people are all pacifists or crypto-pacifists, and they don't want to admit that there can ever be a possibility of the justified use of military force. So what they do is they cook the books, and proportionality is a favorite criterion of theirs because it allows them to argue like this. Oh, look at all the things that can happen that are bad. Therefore, the use of force is unjustified. And so my point is simply to say, hey, wait a minute. First of all, we have to have the other side of the equation if you're going to do a proportionality calculus. And secondly, then we can start looking at what you put in there. And I appreciate the sophisticated, careful analysis that you offered by contrast with that kind of use of the criterion of proportionality. But the question to you is, because you brought it up, earlier on there were a lot of people in uniform here, and these people are going to encounter the criterion of proportionality in rules of engagement and in perhaps dealing with the law of armed conflict. And I have rubbed enough elbows with international lawyers from various countries, Western countries, to know that there is a significant amount of difference among them in how they apply this notion of proportionality, which appears as a result of Protocol 77, Protocol 1, as one of the two criteria, the other being distinction, to deal with the hard cases, the cases that go beyond what's in the black letter law. But then you have the matter of exactly what this means. And I know that from these contacts I've had, that there's some very real differences between Americans who are not bound legally by this, but say that so far as it expresses customary law, we observe it. The Brits who are legally bound by it, the Germans who regard it